My name is Rick Atwater. I'm a licensed clinical professional counselor. My specialty is addictions, and I've been working with addicts and family members since 1982. What I want to share with you is opiate issues that you hear people talking about today. That they call it an epidemic. I started to see more heroin-related cases, mostly family members coming in asking what they can do for their kid. And we started a group called the Heroin Awareness Foundation. Our mission was to educate and increase awareness about the heroin problem at that time. And this was really the beginning of the community becoming aware of the heroin problem. Overdose deaths continue to rise. They continue to this day. We did what we could then, but we want to do more, which is why we want to tell the story that we're going to present to you today. This story that you're about to see is just one story, but it is representative of the 130 people who die in this country every day from opioid addiction overdose. Some of you probably have been affected by addiction. Many of you are likely to have been affected by addiction. Not all of you affected by the heroin epidemic, but by addiction to other things. So watching this documentary might be troublesome for you, might cause you to have feelings that are uncomfortable. So we want you to understand that those feelings are normal. And we hope that you will talk to somebody about those things. Others of you have not been affected by addiction. This might help you to see the size of the problem we face.
You know, he came from a good family. He had 3 siblings. Nothing in his childhood that would make you believe his story was going to end like this. I feel like I knew 2 different people. There was that front, and I do sometimes feel like it was a front he put on for me. We were the nice family he could show, to everybody at work and look like the nice family guy, and then he had this other life and all these things, and I'm sure I don't even know the half of what went on, and I don't want to. At the end, he was really alone, very private, keeping everything hidden. He would wake up and say, "I'm not gonna drink today." And I think that was truly his intention, and he was just completely powerless over it. A friend of mine from Dallas, when we lived in Dallas, she's like, "Don't you remember? He was the fun guy. He was the life of the party. We loved having him at the events." And I forgot all about that. I could call 911 every day. There's a seizure, or he's passed out drunk, or I never know. It was like my life was one big crisis. And so it was my normal. Even his childhood friends, he didn't talk to them very much, if at all. Sometimes I think, what if, these friends had watched him get progressively worse and maybe could have helped him or talked him into, but nobody else can save you. We grew up in Dickinson, North Dakota. It's a small town in the Bakken oil field. It's the kind of town where you just know everybody. He was one of those kids that was just kind of quiet and shy, not the kind of kid who got in trouble at all. I was 17 and he was 19 when we started dating. Like, he and I would go out to eat, we'd go to a movie, that's the kind of things we did together. And then in college, he studied all the time, he made good grades, he was very serious about getting his degree. Once he started his career, he was very devoted to his career, he was very good at what he did. He was a chemical engineer and he worked in oil. It was a pretty good life for a long time. He was a great dad. He was so proud of his girls, he would get them ready for school in the morning because he had a little more flexibility with his time he had to be at work. He loved dressing them up in frilly dresses, and he would swim with them, and he was huge into Halloween. He'd have the music set up outside and the fog machine, and he loved doing that with the girls. He was not a guy who went out to the bars a lot, but he would come home and he'd have a beer, maybe a glass of wine. He got really into wine for a while, pairing wine with food, into the craft beers. So he'd come home from work and he'd pour himself a glass of wine, and he might pour me one too. And what I didn't realize is the whole time while I'm taking care of little kids, I'm running around, I'm giving them baths, I'm getting supper ready, he was refilling that wine glass and refilling it. So what would look like 1 or 2 glasses of wine or maybe 1 or 2 beers was not the case at all. He always stayed up later than I did. I'm a teacher, so I had to be at work on time. He would always say, I have work to do, I have work to do. And sometimes I'd get up in the morning because the girls would get up really early. They were young, 2 and 5 or so at the time. And I'd say, you know, there's a broken wine glass on the floor. Why didn't you clean that up from the night before? Oh, I guess I didn't realize it. I must have knocked it off when I was putting my computer away. I was more worried about the stains on the rug than about drinking. It wasn't even on my radar at that point that it could be a problem. And then one night, I remember we were gonna go out for date night, and I dropped the girls off with a babysitter and went back to pick him up, and he didn't want to leave the house. He didn't want to go anywhere. And I'm like, oh, come on, we haven't done this in so long. We've been home with little kids. We've been, you know, locked in the house with kids. Let's go out and have some fun. And so he finally convinced me, let's go pick up some takeout and come back home and watch a movie. Okay, so we go and we park the car, and he gets out and he falls down in the parking lot. And I said, what's wrong with you? What's going on? And so I get him back in the car and get home, and he says, I want a divorce. I said, what? We've never had this conversation before. Where is this coming from? The next morning he wakes up and he takes it all back. He said, oh, I'm so sorry. I drank too much. I drank too fast. I hadn't eaten enough. Just forget that all happened. And then he said 3 words. He said, I'll cut back. And I thought, perfect. This is a very accomplished guy. He's accomplished a lot with his career. He was Taekwondo. He was really into martial arts, and he went far with it. He won a lot of championships. He actually trained at the Olympic Training Center, and I thought, you know, here's somebody very accomplished with his sports, very accomplished with his career. If he tells me he's going to cut back on his drinking, I had no reason not to believe him. But I also knew nothing about addiction. From alcohol, he channeled it into exercise. And that actually went on for a couple of years. He was training, and he would make these charts, and he'd post it on the fridge, you know, this week I ran 2 miles and I upped it to 5, then, you know, and on and on. And it got to a point with his running where my parents would come down to visit, and we would have things planned, fun things planned, a day at the zoo, and I'd want to leave early to beat traffic, and he had to get that run in. And we'd all be waiting for him, and he's on the treadmill, and he's sweating, and he's, nope, I've got a little bit more time. And I look back on that and I think, wow, that really mirrors his addictive behavior with the drinking that I saw later on. We ended up moving into a different house, and he had always loved swimming with us in the backyard, hanging out with the girls, hanging out in the pool. When we moved into the new house, I noticed it's like I couldn't get him out of the house. We try to go swimming or try to go to the park with the girls. He was always upstairs in the game room. He would actually encourage me to go out a lot with my friends. He'd say, I'll watch the girls. You go out and go to that play with your friends, or go out to eat, have fun, have a good time. And my friends would comment, you know, that's really unusual. Your husband seems pretty cool that he lets you go out and do all this stuff. Well, he was drinking at home, and I had no idea. It's kind of like we got to a point where he fell off a cliff, and the drinking, I guess, just became too much for him to hide. I'll never forget my 4-year-old following him around the house with a bottle of Sky vodka saying, Daddy, don't drink this is bad. And I didn't know what to do. I tried to fix him. You know, I tried to encourage him to stop drinking. Why don't you start running again? You know, you can do this. And then things just got really crazy. I remember I told him, if you get in that car and drive, because you're in no shape to drive, I will call the cops on you. So I called the cops, and I gave him the license plate, the make and model and license plate of his car. And they did talk to him. And he called me, and he just said, you shit. And I was terrified. My blood just ran cold. And so I agreed to go pick him up. But I was terrified. I had to live with this guy. What was I going to do in the middle of the night when he got upset with me? And it's just me, and he's 6'3", and I've got 2 little girls to protect. My husband used to say, the second that first drop of vodka passes through, you know, the second I have that first drop of vodka, I become the world's biggest victim. And I thought that was a really profound statement from him, and very true, because it would always be, you caused me to drink. I drink because you're such a bitch. He would find crazy reasons and pick fights. That's the other thing. He had the kind of job where he could come and go. There was a lot of freedom with his job. He could work from home if he wanted to, which meant he could drink at home all day, and no one would know. If he went into the office at 10 o'clock, no one said anything. It wasn't the kind of job where you punch a clock and you're accountable to people. It was, you do your calculations and you just get them done and turn them in. And, he was trusted at work. He was looked up to. One time he got into a car accident on his way to work. It was actually in our neighborhood. He drove into a light pole in our neighbor's lawn and totaled his brand new BMW. And so the cops come. He was drunk. But they don't see it that way. Here's this guy going to work at this big oil company with this BMW, and he's dressed up. And of course, they're not going to give him a field sobriety test at 9:30, 10 in the morning. So I do feel like he got away with some things because of his money and his job. And there was another issue that was really kept hidden for me. So he was on all these dating websites that I didn't know about, using different names, had all these hidden phones. And one time I saw one of the phones, there were 86 contacts for other women. They were coded, like it would say EH. He met them on eHarmony, and it had little notes. This one's a nurse with 2 kids, or, I suppose so he could remember them, because how do you keep 86 women straight? He also had his work laptop, and then he bought a laptop that looked exactly like his work laptop that wasn't used for work. I thought I had this wonderful life, everything looked perfect on the outside. 2 beautiful little girls, the big house, he had a great job, and yet behind closed doors, I guess nobody really knows what goes on. I didn't even know when I was behind those doors. And I don't even know how many times we went to the rehab, tried to get checked in, and he would say no. One of the things they told me at the rehab, they suggested Al-Anon for me, so I went. Remember, I started December of 2012. It was a long time before I even was able to talk at an Al-Anon meeting, but I learned a lot, and it was comforting to hear that other people live with the problem of addiction, because I didn't know anybody. There was nobody in my personal life that had gone through something like this. And I used to say to my friends at 12-step meetings, I used to say, it's almost like they're slipped a script. Once you're at the point where you're buying vodka every day, it's almost like the clerk slips you a script, and all of our stories are so similar. One time, there was a gentleman, he was homeless. He was in recovery, and then he also went to the same meetings I did because he grew up in an alcoholic home. And I remember he said, once your husband doesn't have the money, maybe that's when this will stop. They tell you don't search for the alcohol or the drugs, don't pour it out. They'll just get more, it'll just drive you crazy. I was definitely crazy. I would search the house. We had a 5,000 square foot house, and I would search that house from top to bottom, a 3-stall garage, and I'd be out there in the middle of the night. I'd wait till he fell asleep. And I found one of the secret phones one time in the garage, and he got so angry. That was probably the time he was the most aggressive with me. I was holding the phone, and it was locked. And he attacked me, he choked me, we fell on the floor, he ripped my shirt. It was horrible. That's where they think some of the drinking came from, trying to manage all of that. He actually at one point rented an apartment. So it's like he had 2 different lives. I was worried about him losing his job, because that was, of course, our main source of income, was his job. And I knew I couldn't pay those bills on my own as a teacher. 2013 is when things got insane. That's when it was very apparent that the addiction took over his life. Hooked up with this woman, and it was just pure insanity. And he would disappear for days. I wouldn't know where he was, and it ended up that he was with her. He was planning a wedding to her, but yet I would talk about divorce. Look, we really need to go to a lawyer. We really need to do this. No, I don't want a divorce. That's not what I want. But you're planning a wedding with somebody else. Do you understand that those 2 things, like something needs to happen different? And it was just I feel like my kid's childhood was very interrupted. It was, Dad's drinking, we're gonna move, we're gonna drive Dad to rehab, and it wasn't focused on them at all. It was me being crazy, searching for bottles. I remember there were times I'd go to the grocery store, and I wasn't even able to get the food. I couldn't even manage planning out what to buy, and much less cooking a meal. He did go to an outpatient and probably was not very truthful. It was actually the first time he disappeared. I went up there to talk to the counselor because I didn't know what to do. And I said, well, I think he has this girlfriend. And she's like, what? He's not mentioned any of this. I lived with the craziness. Once I found out he was an addict, there was about 9 months that I stayed. And I really thought I could help him. I thought I could change him. And it kept spiraling. It was crazier and crazier. He was drunk 24/7. I remember one time he was yelling at me. It was at night, and he's like, why aren't you putting the kids on the bus? Why aren't the kids at the bus stop? I'm like, well, because it's almost time for bed. He would have his first drink in the morning when I took the kids to the bus stop. So that's why he was so angry. He wanted his first drink, and he had no idea what time of day it was. He went to 12-step meetings, and he would come home and he'd say, I'm not like those people. And he would say, I have a career. I've been to college. They haven't. I have this career to worry about. I can't be seen as a drunk. And I couldn't understand. Well, here you are. You're trying to tell me you can't go to these meetings because you're embarrassed, but yet you'll walk around town drunk. You'll go to the liquor store every day. But yet he would put on his work clothes, his nice Brooks Brothers shirts and ties, and tell me he was going to work, even though I knew he wasn't. And one of the counselors even said, these are delusions of grandeur. And she said, it's actually, he probably has a very low opinion of himself. And I was like, oh my gosh, how can you possibly think you're fooling anyone? But he was really trying to fool himself. The fancy cars, the big house, all of the things. He just got to a point where he was physically dependent. You could see him shake all the time. He couldn't even write his name at one point. I remember we were gonna check in, and it was amazing because he would do all these tiny little calculations at his job, and then he couldn't even write his name when he went to check in at rehab. The counselors that I was going to, just a private counselor that worked with families that had addiction problems, as I would go in every week and his behavior was getting crazier and crazier, and she said, look, I've talked to my colleagues, and your kids can't be in that home. They have to get out of that home. You get them out, or I have to call CPS. So she didn't call CPS because I did leave. I didn't know where to go. I packed up the car and we left at 11 o'clock at night, and we drove to my brother's house in Fargo, North Dakota. So we lived separately for a year. My daughter wouldn't talk. My oldest, she was in 4th grade at the time. She didn't talk at school. She hardly talked at home. She would try to call her dad all the time, and of course, he wasn't available. He was deep into his addiction at this point. So then he flies up for Christmas looking like nothing's ever been wrong. Just looked really good, brought presents for the kids, cleaned up. We didn't see any drinking, and it was baffling to see somebody who goes from drunk every day, not knowing what time of day it is, in a pool of vomit on the floor, to all of a sudden like cleaned up like nothing was ever wrong. And we started talking on the phone, and of course he convinced me. He was a very convincing guy. And so I went back. I mean, my kids missed him so much, and we timed it so that we arrived on Father's Day. I go to get into the house, doors are locked, he's not answering the door, he's not answering his phone. I finally managed to get in, and he is passed out in his closet. So I thought, oh my God, I came all the way back across the country to this. We lived in the house together for about a month because I needed time to figure out where I was gonna go, and I packed up what I needed, and then that was our final separation. It amazed me that he kept getting jobs, and good jobs. And so he got a job, and it required a move to another part of Houston. And that's how I got him to agree to sell the house, because that was something I'd wanted for years. I wanted that house sold because my name was on there and I knew I couldn't afford it on my own. So I went to the house to do some cleaning, and I had a friend with me. And I walk into the house, and the whole entire place, and this is a big house, it smells like exhaust, like car exhaust. And so we grabbed the few items, we had a list, we grabbed the few items we needed. I'm like, hold on, I wanna go out into the garage. And I walk out into the garage. He's in there, he's passed out in his car. The car is running, but the garage door is down. Well, what happened was his phone was dying. He needed to charge his phone. The only charger he could find was his car charger. He was so drunk, he forgot to open the garage door. And I really think if I hadn't come and found him, he would have died then. And what he was doing in that car, he was planning his wedding to one of the women. So the final walkthrough is scheduled for the house we're selling. And I was like, he had holed himself up in our guest bedroom and was just drinking around the clock in that bedroom. And I'm like, he can't be in there when they come for the final walkthrough. And so he went and parked himself. He was in the driveway in his car. Music is blasting as loud as it could go. He's drunk as can be. He had a box in the back seat of vodka bottles. And so then I'm like, okay, look, the walkthrough's over. You can go back to your room now. And he gets out of his car and he just falls face first, and the driveway sloped. So he fell, didn't even put his hands out to catch him because he was so drunk. And I was like, oh my God. And when the police came and he was so drunk, I said, can't you arrest him for public intoxication? He was sitting behind the wheel of the car with the car running. Isn't that a charge? Can't you do anything? And they said, we can't take a guy this drunk to jail. So the ambulance comes, and of course he's refusing to get into it. It doesn't have pants on because he shook so bad when he would drink that he couldn't fasten buttons, he couldn't zip zippers. And I'm like, oh my word, here he is, half naked, drunk as can be, belligerent, fighting with the ambulance crew. I'm trying to hold up a towel. Here comes the school bus. Here comes my kid's school bus. We finally managed to convince him to get into the ambulance. They take him to the hospital. I stopped by, and he was so belligerent, I knew not to go back and see him at that point, but I said, he's gonna try to leave. He'll call a cab, he'll call whatever, he'll call Uber. And they're like, oh, we got that taken care of. We told him the wrong address for the hospital. And then he moved into an apartment. When he could, he would come down and spend time with the girls. He'd come down for Halloween, or we'd spend Christmas so he could see the girls open their presents. So I was in touch with him. I went to visit his mom and telling him news from home, and we got back and I said, okay, when do you want to come see the girls? Oh, I'll come this weekend. Well, he calls me, I lost my debit card. I can't come. I got to stay and look for it. Okay, well, just let me know. And by this time I had learned a lot. I knew not to argue. I knew not to accuse him of drinking. I just said, when you're able to, let me know. You can come see the girls. Didn't hear from him. Tried to call him, no answer, which usually I could get in touch with him within a day. And so I finally called a well check, which I had done before, and the police gave me a really hard time. They said, listen, ma'am, we can't just be running around checking on your boyfriend or your husband or whoever this person is. They put me through to the police. They also put me through to the EMTs. So when I explained the situation to the EMTs, and I told them the same things I told the police, and so they said, we're en route. They went in through a window, and he had been dead. It's hard for them to tell you, I guess, the exact time, but I think he died sometime late Wednesday night, early Thursday morning. He was found on Saturday. And I remember calling a friend and having her drive me up there. I had to go up there before they could take the body away. And I still have nightmares sometimes when I see police officers. It was really hard. I had to give a statement because they said, well, if this comes back and it looks like foul play, we're gonna need a statement from you. So I wrote out this statement, and then they start wheeling the body out on the stretcher, and I could see his toes. His toes weren't covered, and that's the nightmare I have sometimes. And they recommended that I not go into the apartment at that time because I guess it was not in good condition. And I remember waiting, not telling the girls, trying to figure out, how am I gonna tell the girls? And so I had this knowledge for like an entire night. And I researched, how do you tell kids this? When my oldest cried, I told them the next day. And my oldest started crying, and my youngest just said, I'm gonna go watch TV now, okay? I got them we go to a place that helps kids who have lost a parent. So they go to that, and they do talk about things now. And so we talk about, what are you gonna do when you're at a party and somebody offers you a drink? How do you think you'll handle that? And I'm very open with them. They know how their dad died. They know about the problems he had with alcohol. They know they have the genetics for this to happen to them. And they saw it. They saw him at his worst, which at the time I felt horrible about that. But now that she's entering that phase in her life where, all the parties and all, the kids think it's very fun to go out and drink and party and do drugs. Maybe it's not so bad that she saw him at his worst. When I look at family pictures, I often think, the whole time we were opening presents on Christmas, or we were basting a turkey for Thanksgiving, and the whole time this addiction was growing inside of him, and I had no idea. I do some things, like I'm part of some Facebook groups, like Widows of Addiction type groups. There was one meeting where somebody brought up, I think she brought up that her husband had cheated, and she found this out, and then people started to say, well, I found out later my husband fathered another child. I found out my husband had porn on his computer. Because sometimes you go and all they talk about is, how much they were in love and how great he was. And here, we had that for a time, but then at the end, the last 3 years were complete hell. So it was very liberating, I guess, to hear other people say, hey, he wasn't perfect. My spouse did some things that I didn't always agree with, because I thought it was just me. I often think that the reason he's dead, some people make it, some people don't, and the reason he died is because he had all the money to fund the addiction. I used to be so upset about all those other women, but now I really can see it's kind of all the same problem. He was just searching for something to make himself feel better.
If you're a family member or a friend or a classmate of someone who has an addictions problem or who has passed away from an opioid overdose, there are resources available to you. Go to a Narcotics Anonymous meeting, a Families Anonymous meeting, or an Al-Anon meeting. Those are great places to learn about the disease and to help yourself. Don't wait for other people to start their recovery. Start your own. Don't be ashamed of the person in your family who has an addiction or what's happened to them as a result of their addiction. Talk about it out loud. Use the word. Say addiction, say heroin. Talk to your neighbors, talk to your friends, or get other resources to help you get unstuck.
Heart beating, blood moving, spirit rising. Uncertain, but all those hard times won't take us down. No, no. These walls, the back and forth,